Charles Bronson, Nicole Eggert, Juan Fernando de Alarcón, I probably said that wrong, and also the title, Japanese word, Kinjite, 1989. Kinjite, forbidden subjects, roughly the equivalent of the English word taboo. Charles Bronson, most famous in this era of the 80s for Death Wish and being the vigilante and going after the bad guy. The movie Kinjite tells the story of a Japanese family that is relocated from Japan to Los Angeles to work at a corporate office because the father will be working at the corporate office of his company that is in LA. We also get introduced to the father of the family. He's Japanese. He is given to weird sexual fantasies, usually involving younger girls. All of this is very much groundbreaking in a sense for the time to be in such a commonly consumed movie and to deal with this topic, hence the title, Kinjite, dealing with these forbidden ideas. We find out there's tension within the family because the father has been reading pornography, or we don't see it, but he refers to it as adult comic books that men read. Not clear whether it is drawn images like an early form of adult manga or whether it is actual just pornography, but there is this lingering problem within the family. We get also the tension that the wife, the mother of the girls, was raised in a Christian manner, going to a Christian school. Whether or not she still is dogmatically a Christian does not really come out in the story. But her idea then of sin and guilt, of right and wrong, being different than her husband's, and there is this tension. He is apparently experiencing sexual attraction to girls, perhaps just a little bit older than his own daughters, hence the taboo. Against this background is Officer Detective Crow, played by Charles Bronson, who is hot on the path as a member of the Vice Squad, chasing down a pimp of little girls named Duke, played by Juan Fernando del Alarcón. Boy, I'm going to mess up his name. He's important, though, because Juan was in a lot of stuff in this era, and he always sort of played the South American pimp or drug dealer. He was very typecast. And I know people get all upset about that these days, but depending on the historical place in which you're setting a film, if people are arriving as immigrants during the potato famine, they're going to be Irish. If you're looking at the drug and sex trade that was going on in the 80s and before, a lot of that dealt with South America. So what are you going to do? You're not going to do what they do today and depict things as being weirdly diverse in weird times and spaces. Anyway, but he's a great actor and he's really good in that role. Maybe he could have played Hamlet in a different era, but he gets a lot of work being this role. And boy, he nails it in Kinjite as the man you love to hate, and you love to see him get tortured by Detective Crow. Unlike the Death Wish movies, Bronson doesn't just kill a whole bunch of people in this, but boy, he gets some time to interact with the pimp and do some damage to him over time. Now, Bronson's character, his daughter, who's roughly the age of the Japanese family's daughters, maybe a little older, gets groped by the Japanese guy on the public transit. And then she reports that this Asian guy, and there's a little bit of discussion about how to tell any details about him in a city that has, hundreds of thousands of foreign visitors as well as native born people who fit the description, so to speak. Ultimately, our greasy pimp Duke abducts the little Japanese girl, the oldest of the two daughters, and begins to force her into a life of prostitution. This is 1989, and we're getting the idea of human trafficking, though I don't think the phrase was coined yet. At least you didn't hear about it on the news framed in that way. You've got human trafficking, underage girls being prostituted, men with weird fetishes, fathers wanting to defend their daughters, men with daughters that have these fetishes. Man, it really covers the spectrum. Kinjite gives us a good insight into the darkness that can be there in the human soul, especially dealing with lust, with fetishes, with perhaps porn addiction that leads to ever increasing levels of depravity in order to keep getting your fix, just like any sort of drug. The pimp ends up with the little girl. Unbeknownst to Crow, he's helping recover the daughter of the guy that groped his daughter on the public transit, a fact which never does come out. By the time Crow's daughter sees the Japanese man, Mr. Hada, she registers that he's familiar, but she's been through it with the police. How many people look alike from your perspective? And so she doesn't seem to be sure enough to finger him as the guy that did it. He's very nervous. He recognizes her. She seems to recognize him, but it gets let go. And there's this interesting lesson sort of in that. But ultimately, Crow ends up helping the Japanese family to get their girl back, but it's too late. She has been raped and abused and peddled out and prostituted. The girl was intentionally put on drugs in order to perform, and it is what we get at the end is her death. She dies of an overdose. It appears to be in the story. She leaves a note in the form of a haiku. She takes the drugs, but it isn't really clear whether she intended suicide. That seems to be the most likely explanation. She intended to do it for the sake of honor because she'd been defiled. Or was she leaving the haiku just in case because she couldn't stop taking the drug and managed to have some with her after they freed her from captivity? She ends up deceased. And then there is finally the big shootout because the haiku she leaves behind gives them the clue of where to find a boat in the harbor where Duke is holed up. And the shooting commences and the bad guys get their comeuppance. Duke, however, the pimp, has been tortured throughout this movie, which is kind of the satisfying part. Instead of lingering through this whole thing with the tension, we get periodic interactions between the police and Duke and his henchmen. One particular funny one, Duke offers a Tiffany diamond watch to Crow. It's worth like 30 grand. It's yours. Take it. And then we never see each other again, trying to bribe him. And Bronson's Detective Crow abruptly makes him eat it. He literally shoves it in his mouth and forces him to swallow this thing. And you get to see him trying to get it down and the drool coming out. And it's incredibly enjoyable to watch the pimp get tortured in this fashion. And his henchmen, his African-American henchmen, who they hold by his boots off a balcony to try to scare him into talking, but accidentally, not realizing how high his boots go, he slips out of his boots and plummets to his death. I'm smiling. You got to see it, because by the time these things happen, they richly deserve it. They have it coming, and it's quite enjoyable to watch. Honestly, Kinjite was not the most famous of Bronson's movies. You know, he was known for Death Wish. He's been in so many things. It was sort of here and gone and not a huge thing. But it is, I would say, it's my favorite Bronson movie. We owned the VHS tape, showing my age. I don't know how many times I watched it on VHS, but it's got everything. It's got the good and evil, but it delves into these real issues of trafficking, of pornography, of addiction, of fetishism, of lust, and yet you still get the satisfying detective story at the end. And it does leave you, the Japanese father, he gets off the hook for having fondled the girl on the public transit. But in the course of the story, you have this idea that he has learned his lesson, that the way things unfolded, that it should happen to him, that his daughter should be victimized. We do see at one point a porn peddler trying to lure him into a porn shop, and he reacts quite violently when the guy expresses how young these girls are, because he's having that visceral reaction now of, I was into this when it was porn, when it was theoretical, when it was kink. Now someone has taken my daughter, someone that maybe read this stuff that I did, that maybe had who went further. And so there is this interesting redemption arc within the family where the father, by the end, we get the idea he has come to grips with the fact that what he's been doing is wrong. He needs to change course and he has to not do this. So whereas the pimp and the bad guys get punished, you have this other bad guy what he did was absolutely wrong, and yet he had touched her, but it wasn't the same as drugging up and gang raping and pimping this other girl. The father in the story gets this sort of redemption arc. He was drunk and into all this kink, and he grabbed this girl, and now he gets a second chance because she doesn't recognize him. He's learned his lesson, and he gets beyond it. So if you haven't seen it, go out and grab it, find it somewhere. I didn't even look to see if it is streaming anywhere right now. When you got the old-fashioned antique VHS tape, pop it in a VCR, pop open a regular Mountain Dew, unless you're diabetic now like me, which may have something to do with my previous habits. Anyway, check out Kinjite, get some of those vintage-looking Doritos from the 80s that they're making now, the taco-flavored vintage bag. Pretend it's 1989 and watch a good Bronson movie, but it has a good point, and it has retribution against the bad guys in the end. You don't get better than that.